September 9th, 1943, 15:12 hours. The Tyrrhenian Sea, off the coast of Sardinia. Admiral Carlo Bergamini stands on the bridge of the Roma, his weathered hands gripping the rail as the Italian fleet cuts through Mediterranean waters at 20 knots. The 45,000-ton battleship, pride of the Regia Marina, vibrates beneath his feet, her four massive turbines driving her toward what should be salvation, Allied-controlled ports in North Africa, where Italy's surrender terms promise safety. Behind Roma, her sister ship, Italia, follows in formation, along with 3 cruisers. The September sun beats down on gray-painted steel as sailors move across decks, many stealing glances northward, toward the German airfields they're desperately trying to escape. Bergamini knows the risk. 3 days ago, Marshal Pietro Badoglio announced Italy's armistice with the Allies, and the Germans, their former allies, have already begun Operation Oxe, seizing control of Italian territory with ruthless efficiency. Every officer aboard Roma understands what German capture would mean. Their ships turned against the Allies, or scuttled, or worse, bombed into oblivion by the Luftwaffe. The fleet departed La Spezia yesterday under the pretense of intercepting Allied forces at Salerno. But Bergamini received secret orders: sail to Malta and surrender the fleet intact. At 15:15 hours, the air raid alarm screams across Roma's deck. Lookouts have spotted aircraft, 11 Dornier Do-217K2 bombers from 3rd Group, Kampfgeschwader 100, approaching from 18,000 feet. The crews are among the Luftwaffe's elite, specially trained at Foggia airfield in southern Italy for a weapon so secret that most German commanders don't know it exists. Major Bernhard Jopp leads the formation, each aircraft carrying a single weapon beneath its fuselage, a 3,450-pound monster designated Ruhrstahl SD-1400X, but the crews call it Fritz X. The weapon hanging beneath Jopp's bomber represents 5 years of German engineering obsession. Dr. Max Kramer began development in 1939 at Peenemünde West, designing what would become the world's first operational precision-guided munition. Unlike conventional bombs that fall ballistically, the Fritz X features cruciform tail fins controlled by radio signals, allowing a bombardier to guide it in flight using the Kell-Strasberg radio control system. A bright flare mounted in the tail lets the operator track the weapon's descent through 20,000 feet of sky. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint. Controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. Testing proved it could penetrate 28 inches of armor plate, enough to punch through the deck of any battleship afloat. Aboard Roma, anti-aircraft crews swing their guns skyward. The 90mm batteries begin firing, black puffs of flak blossoming far below the German bombers. But Jopp's formation holds steady at 18,000 feet, well beyond effective range of Roma's defenses, exactly as doctrine requires. At 15:42 hours, flying at 270 miles per hour, Jope's bombardier centers Roma in his sight and releases. The 11-foot-long Fritz X drops away, its small wings deploying to increase glide range as gravity accelerates it toward terminal velocity. The bombardier hunches over his Foog 203 Kel transmitter, watching the bright flare spiraling downward. He makes minute adjustments with his joystick, small electrical pulses transmitted at 48 megahertz, received by the bomb's Strasbourg equipment, moving the spoilers on the tail surfaces. The weapon responds, correcting course. The parallax problem, triangulating between moving aircraft, moving bomb, and moving ship, requires absolute concentration and steady hands. 17 seconds into the fall, 23 seconds, 31. On Roma's bridge, Bergamini sees it coming. Officers shout course corrections, trying desperately to evade, but the battleship's massive bulk cannot turn fast enough. At 15:44 hours, the Fritz X strikes Roma's starboard side, just forward of turret number 2. The 700-pound Amatol warhead doesn't detonate on impact. The armor-piercing design ensures it continues through the ship's structure. The bomb smashes through reinforced deck plating, through crew compartments, through interior bulkheads, exiting below the waterline before detonating in a massive underwater explosion. The blast effect is catastrophic. Water and flame erupt along Roma's starboard side as the detonation floods both boiler rooms, knocks out 2 propeller shafts, and triggers electrical fires throughout the engineering spaces. The great battleship shutters, losing speed, listing to starboard. Damage control teams race below decks into smoke and chaos. But Major Jope's bombers are already lining up for a second pass. 15:50 hours, 6 minutes after the first impact. Smoke pours from Roma's starboard quarter as the battleship wallows in the Mediterranean swells, her speed bleeding away to 12 knots, then 8. Below decks, Chief Engineer Alfredo Vigna coordinates damage control teams through smoke-filled passageways, shouting orders over the roar of rushing water and the screams of wounded men trapped in flooded compartments. 15:50 hours, 6 minutes after the first impact. Smoke pours from Roma's starboard quarter as the battleship wallows in the Mediterranean swells, her speed bleeding away to 12 knots, then 8. Below decks, Chief Engineer Alfredo Vigna coordinates damage control teams through smoke-filled passageways, shouting orders over the roar of rushing water and the screams of wounded men trapped in flooded compartments. 15:50 hours, 6 minutes after the first impact. The forward boiler rooms are gone. Seawater cascading through ruptured bulkheads, drowning the fires, silencing the turbines. Electrical arcing sparks throughout the stern sections as seawater shorts out power systems, plunging damage control parties into darkness, illuminated only by emergency lanterns and the hellish blow of spreading fires. On the bridge, Admiral Bergamini grips the chart table, his face grim as reports flood in from every section of the ship. The first Fritz X penetrated Roma's armored deck, something conventional bombs dropped from this altitude should never accomplish, before detonating beneath the keel in a position calculated to break the ship's spine. The underwater explosion lifted 45,000 tons of steel, fracturing hull plating, flooding machinery spaces. Bergamini orders the ship to maintain course toward Sardinia, orders destroyers Vivaldi and Denoli to close and prepare to take off wounded. But even as he speaks, lookouts scream another warning. The Dorniers are coming back. Major Yope's formation circles at 18,000 feet, reforming for the killing strike. Through binoculars, the German crews can see Roma clearly, listing, trailing smoke, her anti-aircraft fire weakening as electrical failures knock out gun directors. The other Italian ships, Italia and Vittorio Veneto, maneuver frantically, laying smoke, firing everything they have at the distant specks of the German bombers. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. But Jope's attention remains fixed on Roma. The crippled flagship presents a near-stationary target now, exactly what the Fritz X was designed to destroy. At 16:02 hours, a second Fritz X drops away from its parent aircraft. The bombardier tracks the flare, making corrections, guiding the weapon through its 40-second fall toward Roma's foredeck. Sailors on the weather decks watch it coming. Some dive for cover, others stand frozen, transfixed by the bright flare spiraling down through blue Mediterranean sky. The bomb strikes forward of the bridge, penetrating through multiple armored decks in microseconds. It detonates inside the forward engine room with apocalyptic force. The explosion rips through Roma's vitals. The 700-pound Amatol warhead detonates among fuel lines, high-pressure steam pipes, and ammunition handling rooms. The blast wave propagates forward into the magazine of turret number 2. 300 tons of armor containing dozens of 15-inch shells and propellant charges. The magazine detonates in a cataclysmic secondary explosion that obliterates the entire forward section of the ship. The massive turret, 40 feet across, armored with 15 inches of face-hardened steel, blasts upward and outward, somersaulting through the air before splashing into the sea 200 feet from the hull. The forward superstructure simply ceases to exist. The bridge, the conning tower, the admiral's quarters, the communications center, all vaporized in an instant of white-hot flame and expanding gases. Admiral Carlo Bergamini dies without knowing what killed him, along with Captain Adone del Cima and nearly every officer on the bridge. The blast wave kills hundreds of sailors throughout the forward sections, some incinerated instantly, others crushed by collapsing bulkheads, still others blown overboard by the concussion. Roma begins her death throes immediately. With the bow blown open and flooding uncontrollably, the battleship settles forward, her bow dipping beneath the waves. The list to starboard increases 10 degrees, 15, 20, as asymmetric flooding overwhelms the ship's stability. Survivors claw their way toward the weather decks through smoke and flame, past the burned and dying, through passages tilting at impossible angles. At 16:12, Just 10 minutes after the second hit, Roma's bow plunges beneath the surface, her stern rising as she pivots toward vertical. The structural stresses prove too much. With a grinding screech of tearing metal audible across the water, Roma breaks in two just aft of the second funnel. The forward section, everything ahead of the break, slides beneath the Mediterranean, dragging hundreds of trapped men into the depths. The stern section hangs vertically for a few terrible seconds, propellers pointing skyward, before it, too, slips beneath the waves. By 16:15 hours, exactly 33 minutes after the first Fritz X struck, the pride of the Regia Marina is gone. 16:18 hours, 3 minutes after Roma disappeared. Oil-slicked water boils with survivors, hundreds of men thrashing in the Mediterranean, clinging to debris, calling for help that may never come. Seaman Giuseppe Spano clings to a wooden hatch cover, his ears ringing from the explosion that threw him overboard when the forward magazine detonated. Around him, men struggle in the fuel oil spreading across the surface, thick, black, choking, coating their faces, filling their lungs when waves wash over them. Some wear life jackets, others grasp anything that floats. Shattered deck planking, cork life rings, even bodies of shipmates who didn't survive the blast. The destroyers Vivaldi and Donnelly race toward the survivors, cutting their engines as they approach the debris field to avoid grinding men into their screws. Sailors throw lines, lower cargo nets, form human chains to haul exhausted men from the sea. The rescue is desperate, frantic. Every minute counts as hypothermia and exhaustion claim more lives despite the warm Mediterranean water. Officers scan the oil slick for Admiral Bergamini, for Captain Del Cima, for any of the command staff, but none surface. The bridge was directly above the second explosion. A deep, steady narration, with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. Everyone stationed there died instantly, either vaporized by the blast or trapped when the superstructure collapsed. By 1700 hours, the destroyers have pulled 596 survivors from the water, barely 1/3 of Roma's 1,849-man crew. Another 1,253 men are gone, drowned in flooded compartments, killed by the explosions, pulled under when the ship broke apart, or lost to exposure in the hours following the sinking. It represents one of the single greatest losses of life in Italian naval history, and it happened not in battle against enemy warships, but from 2 bombs dropped from aircraft flying safely beyond anti-aircraft range. 5 miles distant, the remaining Italian fleet steams south at maximum speed.
Italia, Roma's sister ship, shows visible damage from a Fritz X that struck her bow at 1629, punching through 7 armored decks before detonating beneath the keel. But the hit was forward, away from the magazines and engineering spaces, causing flooding that damage control teams can manage. Admiral Romeo Oliva, now senior surviving officer of the fleet, assumes command from Vittorio Veneto and transmits new orders. Abandon the Sardinian rendezvous, make maximum speed for Malta, maintain air alert. Every man in the fleet understands what just happened. The Luftwaffe possesses a weapon capable of sinking battleships from altitudes where conventional anti-aircraft fire cannot reach them. Major Jopes Dornier formation turns north toward Istres airfield in southern France. Their bomb bays empty, mission accomplished. In the bombardier's position, the men who guided the Fritz X weapons barely speak, processing what they've just witnessed. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. They dropped 2 weapons from 18,000 feet and destroyed a 45,000-ton battleship in 30 minutes. The implications are staggering. If radio-guided bombs can sink capital ships with this efficiency, traditional naval doctrine may have just become obsolete. For the cost of 2 weapons and 11 aircraft sorties, the Germans eliminated one of the 3 most powerful battleships in the Italian fleet. The Italian survivors, those pulled from the water by Vivaldi and Danoli, eventually reach Port Mahon in Spain, where they're interned for the remainder of the conflict. The main fleet reaches Malta on September 10th, surrendering to British forces as stipulated in the Armistice Agreement. When Royal Navy officers board Italia and inspect the damage from the Fritz X attack, their reports trigger urgent investigations. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. Allied intelligence has heard rumors of German-guided weapons, the HS-293 glide bomb, the Fritz X armor-piercing variant. But Roma's sinking provides the first confirmation of their operational effectiveness. The wreck of Roma lies undiscovered for nearly 70 years. In June 2012, Italian engineer Guido Gay's underwater robot Pluto Palla locates the battleship approximately 30 kilometers off Sardinia's northern coast, resting in 1,000 meters of water. The wreck remains in 2 sections where it broke apart during the sinking. The forward section containing the bridge where Admiral Bergamini died, The stern section with the engineering spaces that flooded after the first hit. Italian law designates the site as a war grave, protecting the final resting place of the 1,253 men who went down with their ship. September 9, 1943, marked a watershed in naval warfare.
The Fritz X proved that precision-guided munitions could revolutionize combat at sea, allowing aircraft to engage capital ships from beyond defensive range with devastating accuracy. Within 2 years, Allied forces would deploy their own guided weapons, the VB-1 Azon, the GB-4, early television-guided bombs, all descendants of the technological breakthrough the Luftwaffe demonstrated over the Mediterranean.
The age of the smart bomb had begun, and Roma's crew paid the price for that terrible innovation. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone, slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. September 11, 1943, 10:35 hours, Gulf of Salerno, Italy. The Allied invasion fleet lies scattered across 20 miles of coastline, transport ships unloading troops onto contested beaches, cruisers providing fire support, destroyers on patrol stations. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army fights desperately to expand the Salerno beachhead against fierce German counterattacks. And every ship offshore represents vital artillery support the infantry cannot afford to lose. Aboard the cruiser USS Savannah, Captain Robert Carey watches German aircraft approaching high over the mountains, too high for effective anti-aircraft fire, and holding steady course in a way that makes his stomach tighten. At 10 hours, lookouts spot the bombers, Dornier DO-217s from 3rd/KG-100, the same unit that destroyed Roma 2 days earlier. The ship's 5-inch batteries open fire immediately, filling the sky with flak bursts, but the bombers hold at 18,700 feet, beyond effective range. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone, slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history, clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally, subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones, cinematic, documentary-style delivery, with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. Carey orders emergency maneuvers, full speed ahead, hard rudder, trying to throw off whatever bombing run the Germans are executing. But this isn't conventional bombing. The Fritz X drops away at 10:10 hours, its bombardier tracking the tail flare, making corrections, guiding the weapon through the parallax problem as Savannah churns through evasive turns. The bomb strikes Savannah's number 3 gun turret at 10:12, penetrating through the armored roof, punching through 3 decks before detonating in the lower handling room. The explosion tears through the ship's vitals, blowing out the bottom of the hull, flooding engine rooms, triggering fires throughout the forward sections. The blast kills 197 men instantly and leaves Savannah dead in the water, listing streaming smoke. 25 minutes later, the British cruiser HMS Uganda takes a Fritz X through her deck armor, the weapon detonating deep in the ship's structure. The damage is catastrophic but not fatal. Flooding controlled, fires suppressed, though Uganda must withdraw from combat operations for repairs lasting 8 months. At noon, the American light cruiser USS Philadelphia narrowly escapes destruction when a Fritz X passes within 50 feet of her stern, the near miss demonstrating the weapon's precision even against violently maneuvering targets. The attacks continue through mid-September as KG-100's crews exploit their technical advantage. On September 13th, the hospital ship HMHS Newfoundland, clearly marked with red crosses, operating under international protection, takes a Fritz X hit that kills medical personnel and wounded soldiers. Whether the attack represents deliberate targeting or navigation error remains disputed, but the sinking outrages Allied commanders already struggling to counter the guided weapon threat. On September 16th, the battleship HMS Warspite, veteran of Jutland, survivor of countless actions, suffers a Fritz X penetration through her deck armor that floods 6 boiler rooms and kills 9 men. Only heroic damage control saves the 31,000-ton battle wagon from Roma's fate. Allied scientists work feverishly to develop countermeasures. Radio frequency analysis of captured equipment reveals the Kell-Strasbourg system operates at 48 MHz, a frequency jammers can target. By late September, Allied ships begin mounting crude jamming equipment, repurposed radio sets broadcasting noise across the control frequency, disrupting the guidance signal. The effectiveness proves mixed. Some Fritz X attacks fail completely as bombs tumble uncontrolled when guidance cuts out. But German engineers respond with frequency-hopping transmitters and more powerful signals. The electronic warfare battle, one of history's first, becomes a constant evolution of measure and countermeasure. Fighter patrols prove more decisive. Allied air commanders order combat air patrols at higher altitudes, specifically hunting the vulnerable DO-217s that must hold steady course throughout Fritz X attacks. Once spotted, the bombers cannot evade. Breaking off means losing control of the weapon already falling toward its target. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint. Controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. RAF Spitfires and P-38 Lightnings begin scoring kills against KG-100's crews, and losses mount. By November 1943, the Luftwaffe restricts Fritz X operations to night attacks or missions with heavy fighter escort, sharply limiting the weapon's effectiveness. The final major success comes on November 26, 1943, when a Fritz X strikes and sinks the troopship HMT Roma in the Mediterranean, killing 1,149 Allied soldiers, the largest loss of American troops at sea in a single action during World War II. But this represents the weapon's last significant victory. Allied air superiority over European waters makes daylight-guided bomb attacks suicidal, while jamming and evasive maneuvers reduce hit rates to levels barely justifying the specialized crews and expensive weapons. Between July 1943 and December 1944, Ruhrstahl produces 1,386 Fritz X weapons, with 602 expended in testing and combat accuracy averaging just 20%. Revolutionary compared to conventional bombing, but far below the 50% achieved in controlled trials. May 8, 1945. Wright Field, Ohio. American engineers stand in a secured hangar examining what remains of a captured Fritz X weapon, one of 17 specimens recovered intact from captured German airfields and storage depots across Europe. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. May 8, 1945. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Watson, leading the Army Air Force's Technical Intelligence Team, circles the 11-foot weapon slowly, studying the cruciform tail assembly, the Strasbourg radio receiver housing, the spoiler control mechanisms that made precision guidance possible. Every measurement gets recorded, every component photographed and catalogued. The war in Europe ended yesterday, but the real work, understanding how the Germans achieved radio-guided weapon accuracy years ahead of Allied programs, has only begun. The Fritz X's combat record tells a story of revolutionary technology constrained by tactical limitations. Between July 1943 and April 1945, the weapon sank or severely damaged at least 6 major warships. A deep, steady narration with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery, with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. The Italian battleship Roma, the British battleship Warspite, the American cruiser Savannah, the British cruiser Uganda, the destroyer HMS Janus, and the transport HMT Rona. Additional hits damaged numerous other vessels, proving that precision-guided munitions could engage capital ships from altitudes where conventional anti-aircraft fire remained ineffective. Yet only 1,386 weapons were produced during the war, with combat accuracy averaging just 20%.
Impressive compared to conventional bombing's 1 to 2% hit rate against maneuvering ships, but far below the 50% achieved in controlled testing. The weapon's tactical vulnerabilities ultimately prevented it from changing the war's outcome. The deep, steady narration, with a calm but commanding tone, slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint, controlled intensity during dramatic moments, quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery, with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. The Do-217 bombers carrying Fritz X had to maintain steady course for 40 seconds during each attack, making them sitting targets for Allied fighters once air superiority shifted. Radio jamming disrupted the 48 MHz control frequency, forcing German engineers to develop wire-guided variants that never reached significant production. Most critically, the Luftwaffe simply lacked aircraft and trained crews to deploy Fritz X in numbers sufficient to threaten Allied naval operations. By late 1944, with German air power collapsing and Allied air defenses strengthening, Fritz X operations ceased almost entirely. Yet the technological breakthrough remained undeniable. Dr. Max Kramer's design, radio-controlled spoilers responding to bombardier inputs, visual tracking via tail flare, penetrator warhead with delayed fuse, established principles that would guide precision weapon development for decades. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. A deep, steady narration, with a calm but commanding tone. Slightly gravelly, mature voice that carries the weight of wartime history. Clear, deliberate pacing, never rushed, allowing tension to build naturally. Subtle emotional restraint. Controlled intensity during dramatic moments. Quieter and reflective during tragic ones. Cinematic, documentary-style delivery with precise emphasis on key names, dates, and actions. A voice that sounds authoritative, historical, and inevitable. American engineers studying the captured specimens noted how the Germans solved the parallax problem, how they balanced control authority against aerodynamic stability, how they designed the Kael-Strasberg radio link to provide reliable command transmission across miles of sky. These lessons flowed directly into post-war American programs. The Azon and Razon guided bombs. The ASM-N2 Bat glide weapon. Eventually, the television-guided weapons of Korea and Vietnam. The Fritz X proved that guided munitions could revolutionize warfare, but it also revealed the infrastructure required to deploy them effectively. Secure production facilities, specialized training for operators, aircraft capable of reaching target areas and maintaining attack profiles, electronic countermeasure resistance. These requirements would shape guided weapon development through the Cold War era, as engineers progressively solved each limitation. Infrared seekers eliminated the need for visual tracking. Inertial guidance systems freed launch aircraft from maintaining course.
turbofan propulsion extended range beyond defensive envelopes. Each innovation built upon foundations the Fritz X established.
Today, precision-guided munitions dominate modern warfare. Laser-guided bombs, GPS-guided JDAMs, cruise missiles with terminal guidance, all descendants of the weapon Max Kramer designed in 1939 and Major Bernhard Jobst's crews employed over the Mediterranean in 1943. The Fritz X's 20% hit rate seems primitive compared to modern weapons achieving 90% accuracy, but that comparison misses the revolutionary leap from 1 to 2% unguided accuracy to 20% guided precision. The Italian sailors who died aboard Roma, the American crew killed on Savannah, the British personnel lost on Warspite, they experienced warfare's future, a future where distance no longer guaranteed safety and capital ships could be destroyed by single weapons delivered from beyond visual range. The wreck of Roma remains on the seabed 30 kilometers off Sardinia, protected as a war grave where 1,250 men rest in the darkness. Above that grave, merchant ships and naval vessels transit the Mediterranean using GPS navigation, radar surveillance, electronic warfare systems, technologies that trace their lineage directly to that September afternoon in 1943, when 2 Fritz X weapons fell from 18,000 feet and changed naval warfare forever. The age of the smart bomb had begun, purchased with blood and demonstrated with terrible finality. History would remember the lesson.